All right, welcome back. And in this next lecture, we're going to talk about coat markings. So, really, again, the two areas that we're going to look at is the face and then also the legs. So we're going to kind of walk through this and give you the verbiage on what we call different markings on the face. So, looking at this image at the end of this lecture, you should easily be able to identify all these markings on these horses. So the first marking is what we call a star, and these can be really subtle, really light. I mean, sometimes you just see just some white hair in there, or they can be what I call bold. They're really bright, really, really there. So, in this image, this would be a faint one, and then this one would be like a really bold star. And if you wanted to see what this looked like on, actual horses, so here's one where it's just a very faint star. This one's kind of middle of the road, and not all the time, they're going to be different patterns. They're always not circular. And then here's one with a pretty bold star right there that's pretty out there. I mean, you can see that, and you're like, oh, that's a star. So that's what we call, any marking, between the eyes on the forehead. And then we'll jump down to the lips of the horse, and then we call this a snip. So you can see here between the nasal bones and then or the upper lip of the horse, we call these snips. And again, they can be either really, really bold or they can be really, really subtle. So again, with these two, obviously here too, you can see really there's no more white markings on that. That's just snips on the horse. And that's what we call that. And then the middle one is a strip, or sometimes some people call it a stripe, which either or is okay. And the white is between the nasal bones. So if you look at the nasal bone of the horse here and here, you can see the whites in between that. So when we do see that, then it's a strip or a stripe. Okay, and again here, this horse, it's pretty bold, but again, still between the nasal bones, we would still call that a strip. Now, with most horses, it's they're going to have a combination of these on the face. They're either going to have one or two or all three. And we also call these, we either say they're continuous or non-continuous. So continuous is, the best example, all four of these here are continuous, where, you have the star, the strip, and the snip. So in all three of them, they're all running together. Non-continuous is the example right here, where you do have a star, you do have a strip, and you do have a snip, but it's broken. So if you wanted to see this again on real horses, here's one with a continuous star, strip, snip. Okay, and then on this foal, you have a star and a strip, and then on this horse, you have a star and a snip. Okay, so pretty easy with the facial markings. Now, the one where people sometimes get confused, and that's between a strip and a blaze. Okay, a blaze, we consider it a blaze anytime that white starts to either meet or exceed outside those nasal bones. So this picture is a pretty clear definition of what we would call a blaze. Now again, seeing this on live horses, this one here, you can definitely see that it's got the flaxen mane and tail. You can see it's outside the nasal bones. It's clearly a blaze, and that's what we call a blaze. Now it gets a little tricky. Once you get these horses that, again, are in between, maybe somebody would say star, strip, snip. Okay, I mean, you can get away with that. But again, this you would probably clearly define as a blaze because it's meeting the nasal bones or exceeding a little bit of the nasal bones there. So that's what a blaze would look like. Now, there's some really cool white markings, too, that have some special nomenclature. And the first is a bald face. So you can see this foal where the white blaze extends past the eyes. So, all of the white is in the face, and we call that a bald face. And then the next one is really neat too, and that's called an apron. And this is where you get, it's called an apron because it looks like somebody put an apron over their face, where you get the white running up almost underneath the throat latch with this horse. So that's what we call an apron. And then one of my favorites, I think this one's always great too, is called the medicine hat. And you can see it's just the dark areas around the top of the head and the ears. So there, and if they have that, we call that a medicine hat. So I think it's really cool. I think it's a really cool marking. So that's kind of sums up most of the facial markings that are most common amongst horses. The next is the leg markings, and we're going to work our way up. So we'll start at the hoof and work our way up the leg. And the first one is when you just have some white just along the hoof or just above the hoof. So we either call them a white heel or you'll sometimes hear the term ermine marks. And in this next image, in these next two images, you can clearly see where the white is along the heel here. So that's pretty clearly a white heel. And then here you can see there's some white here, and it's kind of non-continuous, kind of spotty around there, and those we would probably call ermine marks. So when there's just a little bit of white above the hoof. Now, if it is continuous and runs all along the hoof or the bottom of the hoof, around that coronary band, remember this is where that anatomy kind of helps to remember, because a lot of these markings on the leg refer to the anatomy. And when there's just some white just above that, but really not too far up the pastern, we would call that a coronet. Now the next one is when you do have white running up the coronet, from the coronet up the pastern, but stops at the fetlock here. So you can see it runs all the way up the pastern, but stops at the fetlock. And we'll call that a pastern. Now, this one, you can see it's halfway up the pastern and some of the white runs up here. So you kind of see that. So I'll make a little boot. So there you go. So you can see where some of that white runs up. Some people may say that's a partial pastern because it almost looks like a coronet, but you have some white running up it. They would call that a partial pastern. So again, looking on a live animal, or what would be an alive animal rather than a picture, there you can see what is clearly marked a pastern. Now, when it does go above the fetlock, that's when we would call it a fetlock. Or sometimes you have that white running up partially. Some people may call that a partial fetlock. So here, you can see here where it's above the fetlock joint. So here's the fetlock joint here, and it's above it. Almost a sock, which is our next one, but not quite. So we would probably call that a fetlock. Now a sock, what we call a sock, is generally when the white runs up about halfway up the cannon bone. Okay, but does not go up above the knee on the front legs or the hock on the hind legs. So this is the hock on the hind legs. So the white is almost halfway up, but doesn't exceed there. So that's what we would call a sock. So again, looking at these horses, you can see the cannon bone halfway, that's a sock, halfway, those are socks. Now again, if it ran up here, you can see here, again, drawing that weird looking boot there, you can see where, that would be still a sock. So not quite the next one, which is called a stocking. So a stocking is when it actually reaches the hock or the knees or goes above it. So here's what we call a stocking. And then here on the left is clear two stockings on the hind legs. So that's what we would call a stocking. Now this next one, you do have a stocking here. Okay, so here's the knees. Okay, so that white is meeting the knees. But this one doesn't extend past the knees. Now there's a little bit of white here, but not quite. So this one we would probably still call a sock. And then this one we would call a stocking. Okay? Now the final thing we'll talk about with identification is these weird things called chestnuts, or some people call them night eyes. And again, this is what's so cool about horses, or equids, donkeys have these too, is they think this is a remnant from evolution where, if we remember, we went from 4 to 3 to a single-toed animal, and those toes migrated up the leg. Well, they believe these chestnuts is kind of just a remnant of that's still kind of around. And what a lot of people believe too is that these are really unique. Each one's unique to a horse, where they're almost like fingerprints. Now they do grow a little bit, so they can scuff off, kind of that dead skin on there. But some breed registries actually do require photographs, and like the Jockey Club in certain circumstances will actually require somebody to go in there and take a photograph of those night eyes as a unique mark to that animal. So just to be aware, if you're always wondering what those weird things were, that's what they are. So that concludes the end of week 2. And, again, this week we talked a lot about hoof anatomy, laminitis, hoof care, and then jumped into coat markings and coat colors. So just a reminder, take quiz 2. the quiz questions come directly from the lectures and the slides, so they should be very, very straightforward if you've been paying attention and taking notes. And also complete assignment 1, so that's going to be the due before the beginning of week 3, which shouldn't take you a whole heck of a lot of time. And you can actually, I made a video to clearly explain what the expectations should be for that assignment. And then you're going to be asked to do a peer eval of at least three of your peers that you can go in there and look at their assignments, give them feedback, give them a score, and that's going to be due by the end of week 3, the beginning of week 4.